After World War II, the United States adopted a foreign policy of actively promoting democracy worldwide, driven by both ideological and strategic considerations. Faced with the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global rival, the U.S. saw democracy as a counterpoint to communism and a way to secure its interests. This policy manifested through initiatives like the Marshall Plan, which aimed to rebuild Western Europe and strengthen democratic institutions, and the establishment of NATO, a military alliance of democratic nations. The Truman Doctrine further solidified this commitment by providing economic and military aid to countries resisting communist influence. During the Cold War, the United States actively lent a helping hand to democratic movements and independence movements in different countries. They did this especially in places that held strategic importance to their global interests, like Greece and Turkey. The goal was to make democratic institutions stronger and prevent communism from spreading. In Greece, for instance, the U.S. provided a lot of money and military support to the Greek government as they fought against communist rebels during the Greek Civil War. In Turkey, the U.S. offered economic aid to help with the country's recovery after World War II, with the hope of promoting political stability and democratic governance. The United States was all about promoting democracy, and they believed that having open markets and embracing capitalism was a big part of that effort. They thought that economic freedom and political democracy went hand in hand. So, they pushed for free market principles and economic liberalism because they wanted to create a situation where people could have economic opportunities, make choices, and also take part in democratic processes. The promotion of human rights, including freedom of speech, press, and assembly, became an integral part of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. advocated for these principles on the international stage. After the Cold War, the United States remained dedicated to promoting democracy, especially in Eastern Europe and countries moving away from authoritarian rule. The U.S. provided support for democratic institutions, free and fair elections, and civil society to help these nations transition to democracy and stability in a changing world. However, the United States' efforts to promote democracy and engage in peacekeeping weren't without flaws. While the U.S. frequently cited democracy and human rights as its guiding principles, it faced criticism for actions that contradicted these ideals. The primary goal of countering communism during the Cold War often led to alliances with authoritarian regimes willing to align with U.S. interests, removing socialist-leaning governments and replacing them with American-leaning ones, even if they violated human rights and suppressed democratic freedoms of their own citizens. This practical approach sometimes meant supporting governments that prioritized their own interests over democratic values, creating debates about the consistency of U.S. foreign policy in advancing democratic principles. There have been numerous coups throughout the world led by the USA with the help of the CIA. These actions may be attributed to the United States pursuing its own national interests, which include a range of factors, from its involvement in the banana business in Guatemala and the construction of the Panama Canal to its pursuit of oil resources in the Middle East. In 1954, the United States, with CIA involvement, helped oust Guatemala's President Jacobo Arbenz. The main reason was Arbenz's land reform policies, which threatened the interests of the American company United Fruit Company. The government sought to seize underutilized land, including property owned by the United Fruit Company, and redistribute it to landless peasants in an effort to address long-standing social inequalities. The U.S. then supported rebel leader Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. Propaganda and unrest in Guatemala led to Arbenz's resignation, allowing Castillo Armas to take power, reverse the reforms, and benefit United Fruit Company. The United States played a crucial role in both gaining control of the Panama Canal and helping Panama achieve independence from Colombia. In 1903, with U.S. support, Panama declared itself independent from Colombian rule. The United States created a whole country just to have control of a canal, an important choke point. This move was driven by America's strong interest in building and controlling the Panama Canal, a vital waterway connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, which had great economic and strategic importance. After Panama became independent, the U.S. quickly recognized it as a sovereign nation and negotiated the Hay-Bonal-Varilla Treaty, which granted the United States control over the canal zone. The U.S. has often mixed its quest for Middle Eastern oil with getting involved in regional issues. Because the Middle East has a lot of oil, ensuring a steady supply has been really important for the U.S., so they've taken actions to make sure they have access to that oil, like supporting friendly governments, sometimes even changing the leaders in power, and supporting rebel groups, for example as U.S. along with UK did in the 1953 coup in Iran, driven by Mossadegh's nationalization of Iran's oil and supporting local armed factions that align with their interest. These moves have had big and long-lasting effects on the region's politics and have sparked a lot of debates and controversies. In many cases, U.S. foreign policy decisions were driven by economic considerations, strategic interests, and maintaining access to crucial resources, which sometimes led to support for governments that prioritized U.S. interests, even if it meant turning a blind eye to issues related to democracy and human rights in those nations. The United States, often with assistance from the CIA, has been involved in orchestrating numerous coups around the world. In 1973 in Chile, the U.S. backed a military coup to oust President Salvador Allende because of concerns about his socialist policies and perceived alignment with the Soviet Union. In 1961, the U.S. was involved in a series of events that contributed to the removal of Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba of the Republic of Congo, partly due to concerns about his perceived leftist leanings and potential alignment with the Soviet bloc. While not a traditional coup, the U.S. provided support to the military junta in Argentina, which seized power in 1976. This support was seen as a way to counter leftist movements in the country. The coup resulted in a period of severe human rights abuses with thousands of casualties. The U.S. also supported Contra rebels in Nicaragua in their efforts to overthrow the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua due to concerns over the spread of communism in Central America. The conflict led to casualties among combatants on both sides and civilian casualties. Most notably, the U.S. entered the Vietnam War during the Cold War to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, U.S. supporting South Vietnam and USSR and China supporting North Vietnam. The war resulted in millions of casualties, including military and civilian deaths, injuries, and long-lasting health issues due to the use of chemical agents like Agent Orange. The war had a deep and lasting effect on the region's politics, and it left behind a legacy of immense suffering. And conversely, the USA supported resistance groups in Afghanistan with the aim of weakening the invading Soviet Union, which later backfired. And numerous coups and aiding rebellions in countries such as Indonesia, Brazil, Dominican Republic, Greece, Libya, Syria, and so on. Looking at these historical instances, it seems that the U.S. foreign policy was driven by a determination to achieve certain objectives, even if it meant accepting casualties as a potential outcome, while justifying it as necessary for their broader goals. This situation arose during the Cold War when both the USA and the Soviet Union were competing to influence newly independent nations to adopt their respective systems, even if it meant replacing one dictator with another. To simplify, think of it this way: suppose you want to carry out a project, like building a dam or oil rigs. In a democratic system, you need the consent of every citizen and their elected representatives, which can take time and be a complex process. However, in an autocratic regime, all you need is the approval of one dictator. If the dictator agrees, everything can move forward swiftly, often serving the interests of global powers more efficiently. Anyway, many countries have experienced economic growth by aligning themselves with the United States, tapping into foreign aid, trade agreements, investments, and diplomatic backing. Notably, countries in the Arab Gulf region, along with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, and several others, have used these partnerships to fuel their economic progress and prosperity. In brief, U.S. foreign policy has been shaped by ideology, strategic interests, and economic concerns. While the U.S. has championed democracy and human rights, it has at times supported autocratic regimes for practical reasons. These actions, viewed in their historical context, reveal the complexities of foreign policy decision-making.